I swear every time I look into this plane's existence, I love it more and more. Today we're going to talk about my favorite fighter jet of all time, the most combat-proven and arguably the best 4th generation fighter in the world, the F-15 Eagle. When I say favorite, I need you to understand something. I don't know how much you guys know about YouTubers who make videos using these cartoon-looking characters up here, but some of them have things like lore and origin stories, sometimes to the point you can make a whole TV show out of them. And in my case, I command a wing of starfighters that look like this. This is how out of hand we're about to get today. There are a lot of different stories on where the F-15 came from. Some say it was caused by the MiG-25, some say it was based on the lessons of Vietnam, and some say the Fighter Mafia helped make it something useful. And the short version is that somehow this piece of American magic was a literal lottery win that came from the Goldilocks zone of the Venn diagram made out of bureaucracy, bullshitting, and shit pants.
Oh, shit.
The F-15 story officially begins with the FX program. By the time the US went to Nam in 1965, the Air Force was already starting to wake up to the reality they didn't have a machine dedicated to inserting dominance when they penetrated enemy airspace. Which begs the question, why didn't they have one of those? It seems kind of important, you know, a fighter that fights all the fighters so you can clear the airspace for fighting everything else. Kind of seems like the point of an Air Force. And the philosophy they were using to reach that point started evolving all the way back in World War II. When the US entered World War II, they were really only slightly prepared and had to stand up most of their military and doctrines from scratch. And that included figuring out how to effectively employ an Air Force. So naturally, they started from the beginning and asked themselves the first obvious question, why should we have it? Which we can all agree is a pretty obvious answer. They're really freaking cool. Okay, that's not actually the answer. The actual point of an Air Force is to achieve air superiority, which means destroying an enemy's Air Force in a region and letting your Air Force turn their skies into an aerial playground for you to do whatever you want, usually in the form of supporting ground or naval forces in their objectives. And at the time, America believed that the fastest way to achieve air superiority was to destroy runways and critical manufacturing facilities to prevent the enemy from sustaining and rebuilding their Air Force. And since they had the biggest payloads, it would be much easier to do this with large formations of heavy bombers rather than fighters, and cover them in machine guns that could protect themselves and double fist an enemy's fighter force.
Stop fisting me!
So the US would initially develop an air warfare doctrine centered around bombers, but once they entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the British would warn the US against relying exclusively on them, because during the Battle of Britain, the RAF demonstrated how easily bombers can be hunted down by coordinated fighter aircraft. They advised the US that if they were going to exclusively rely on bombers, they should limit their attacks to being done at night. However, this is America we're talking about. We go where we please, and just like any angsty teenager with no real-world experience, we elected to do things the hard way. The US would decide to be one of those stick-up-the-rear Dark Souls players with a chip on their shoulders that need to prove they're the best by using melee classes only and getting good, and stuck to unescorted daylight bombing raids. Of course, this would prove to be a terrible use of our human capital, or as most people would say it, a waste of time and human life, because Luftwaffe fighter planes would attack American bombers and cause absolutely massive losses on pretty much every mission, sometimes as high as 50%.
You have failed the vibe check.
Because if you have stuff, you need more stuff to protect that stuff. Most basic rule of warfare. Now that the US has snapped back to reality, they would finally do what they should have done from the start and put more and more fighters in the air on both intrusive sweeps and escort missions. This would not only improve bomber survival rates, but some might even say it also preemptively earned the US Army Air Forces the title of Chair Force for their rapid increase in their ability to issue death certificates to enemy airplanes. It was because of that combined fighter-bomber force that air superiority could actually be established, because they would have roughly a third of their fighters escorting bombers, and the rest go out and cause fishbowls of fuckery wherever they could find the enemy. And in a lot of cases, fighters would actually help win the skies by not fighting in the skies, and instead strafing enemy planes while they were still on the ground. Basically, the US got tired of spawn camping, and they decided to one-up the enemy so hard they're not even going to launch the game. Just as an example, before the Allies invaded Sicily, US fighters would strafe and bomb more than half of the Axis force, which by itself gave them the numerical advantage in the battles to come. The new air superiority approach worked so well that by the time D-Day came around, General Eisenhower would assure the landing forces, if you see fighter aircraft over you, they will be ours. Do you understand how morale boosting it has to be to go into a mission that seems impossible and hear your commander say, don't worry about this entire avenue of attack, the enemy force does not exist here because we're just that much better than them? That has to be like Viagra for an attacking force.
Stop. My
this can only get so erect.
Using fighters in conventional dogfighting and tactical strike roles would prove to be highly effective throughout World War II and the Korean War. But after Korea, the US changed the game. Eisenhower, now the president, believed that nuclear strikes would end the ability to wage a conventional war, and thus a standard air superiority fighter didn't matter, even though they had literally just used it for that exact job in Korea after the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. The Air Force, also forgetting the value and contributions of air superiority aircraft, would go right back to trying to do everything the fastest way. Destroy the enemy on their runways and blow up their supply chains so the ones that survive aren't as useful.
Son of an emerald whore. Starting again!
Look, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. If you hide from or ignore parts of the past because you don't like them or they're inconvenient for you, you gear your solutions around a problem that either isn't accurate or doesn't exist. And then you end up in historical records like this video being remembered as yet another source on the long list of history's great mistakes. And within a few months of Vietnam getting started, American aircraft would encounter the greatest middle finger to the bomber doctrine, the Integrated Air Defense Network. Surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, and seemingly obsolete fighters were tearing through U.S. tactical support fighters and made it very evident the new air power doctrine was anything but useful.
I need to see this play like I need a hole in the head.
So the Air Force started putting together a concept formulation package for a medium fighter known as the FX program, and it was going to be incredibly role-focused and could out-dogfight any adversary. No, I'm just kidding. By mid-1966, the Aeronautical Systems Division decided the most effective design out of some 500 selections submitted by multiple defense contractors was something I can only describe as a combat Learjet. They wanted a fighter with variable sweep wings, horizontal tails mounted to potted turbofan engines with a bypass ratio of 2.2, in other words, twice as much air going around the engine core as through it, a Vulcan cannon with 1,000 rounds, 4,000 pounds of bombs, and a top speed of Mach 2.7 and the latest and greatest in weapons delivery avionics. They estimated this would make the fighter take care of any and all jobs it was tasked with, despite weighing over 60,000 pounds, having a thrust-to-weight ratio of only 0.72, and being very much not an air superiority fighter.
More slot, please. My bowl is out.
And this design philosophy and idea was contested heavily by the other group of design thinkers at the time, which demanded an air superiority focused fighter and called themselves the Fighter Mafia. Before we go anywhere else, the Fighter Mafia is honestly a very accurate name because they were all about dogfighters and they used every underhanded trick under the sun to get what they wanted. The Mafia, led by Major and then later Colonel John R. Boyd, are the closest thing Congress ever had to industry plants in the Air Force with all the backdoor crap they got away with. See, in 1954, an engineer at Douglas Aircraft Company named Edward Rutowski came up with a series of equations and charts to mathematically relate an aircraft's weight, speed, and other items to calculate its fuel range. Boyd proceeded to copy all of that, convert it to dogfighting, add a comparison between the F-4C and the MiG-21 as an oddly convenient example, and then leverage a new friendship with mathematician Thomas Christie at Eglin Air Force Base to gain unauthorized access to a large-capacity, high-speed computer to double-check his math. The only reason he wasn't outright fired for that last bit was because the Air Force Proving Ground Center's vice commander, a one-star general, kept covering their asses until they published their work.
Hold up, cap and a half.
This information made its way to multiple 3- and 4-star generals debating with the multi-role advocates who would use it to conduct several studies, producing results supporting their arguments. They would also bring Boyd onto the FX program directly in October of 1966, at which point he and others, quote, popped out a 40,000-pound aircraft with an engine bypass ratio of 1.5, a thrust-to-weight ratio of 0.97, and a top speed of Mach 2.5 by the spring of next year. He later claimed that continued studies into his numbers would convince him to change some of his answers to be more optimal, which magically lined up with some of the exact numbers used in this soon-to-be F-15, which sounds a lot to me like he changed his answers later so he could play it off as being right all along and not a broken clock that just so happens to be right this time of day.
Yay, pain!
Regardless of Boyd's BS, the Air Force would eventually unite on a final decision between the multi-role and air superiority factions, based primarily on 2 factors. The first was their rivalry with the Navy, who they'd been initially cooperating with because this was still the period of attempting standardization. After repeated attempts throughout the entire string of events to keep to a common design and the fallout of the naval F-111, the Navy and Air Force were finally allowed to design separate planes tailored to just their needs. However, this was only allowed on the condition that both aircraft use some some common parts, and that any proposal made to one branch had to have a variant made for the other branch. Since the Air Force still had the whole #NotMyBoat stick up their rear that was causing their landslide of issues in Vietnam, they did not want to be stuck with a variant of a Navy fighter plane, and decided it was finally time to quit beating around the bush and make a call.
It's showtime.
And so in light of the volume of problems the MiG-21 was causing in Vietnam and the 1967 unveiling of the MiG-25, which American intelligence mistook for a superfighter that could outdo anything they had or might have, the Air Force finally pulled it together and decided they wanted a dedicated air superiority fighter that could smell all the commie tears the minute it set foot on the field. The MiG-25 really thought it was all that in a bag of chips, and America's military-industrial complex is about to respond with,
Y'all hear some?
the new minimum requirements were for a single-seat, twin-engine fighter that could clear a 50-foot obstacle in a 3,000-foot takeoff run with a 4,000-pound load, a 230 nautical mile radius of action on internal fuel only, and a max range of 2,600 nautical miles, plus Mach 1.1 on the deck and up to Mach 2.7 in bursts at high altitude, smokeless engines, high-energy maneuverability, look-down, shoot-down radar, and guided missiles for BVR fighting, plus having a limited secondary role in ground attack once air superiority was established. After much developmental deliberation, the contract for the F-4 Phantom's replacement was awarded to the Thrust Bricks developer, McDonnell Douglas. And this may be pretty, but I like this. In 1972, Mickey D would finally test fly the F-15, another thrust brick which I can best describe as the F-4 Phantom if it cut carbs and started doing cardio and calisthenics. Because this thing can throw itself all over the sky and still manhandle everything in its line of sight and out of it. One of the most important assets the Eagle got was a low wing loading, or ratio of aircraft weight to wing area. This lets the Eagle be a much bigger fighter while still having fantastic agility for its size, able to vastly outmaneuver the F-4 Phantom and even stay padlocked on the tail of the much nimbler F-5 Tiger. The Phantom and jets of its time generally had a much higher wing loading, giving them the general tendency to turn like a sack of wet bricks as physics would predict. The Eagle, however, looks at the laws of physics and goes,
I reject your reality and substitute my own!
Because the sheer volume of capability the Eagle had for the time was downright biblical. For starters, the Eagle would get a pulse Doppler multi-mode radar that gave it the advantage of look-down capability. In English, that means the F-15 could pick out and track targets flying below the horizon of motion and fire on them. And if you needed more vanilla detection methods up close and personal, the F-15 came with an all-round glass canopy that gave the pilot excellent visibility of his surroundings. Much like the Phantom, they would carry 4 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles and 4 Sidewinders, but unlike the Phantom, it would also carry the Mystifier 6000 internally, aka a 20mm Vulcan cannon with 940 rounds, and 3 hardpoints for external fuel tanks or 15,000 pounds of smart or dumb bombs. Even with the reduction in hardpoints and ordnance capacity, this thing had more air-to-air certainty and firepower than the hand of God, to the point that the Israelis called their Eagles flying SAM sites, because any one of these things could flatten whole enemy flights into topographical readjustments all on their own. There were also some cool-looking aerodynamic choices that boosted the Eagle's ability to handle high-speed maneuvers, like the twin vertical tails, which doubled yaw control across the board, or the tooth on the front of the horizontal tails. Now, that spike isn't actually new to the F-15, but it is really important. It's called a dogtooth edge, and what it does is it makes the plane better able to handle high speeds. Basically, every structure has a vibration frequency at which it will actually fall apart, called a harmonic frequency. When an airplane reaches a high enough speed, the aerodynamic forces at play will cause the wings and other surfaces to vibrate up and down, like when you stick your hand out of the window of your car and go up and down, up and down. At a high enough speed, these vibrations will occur fast enough to reach this harmonic frequency, and the entire plane will shatter itself like a glass window that got shot past at Mach 1. There are different ways of avoiding this, but one of them is changing the structural layout of the airframe. The dogtooth structure on the horizontal tail is one such change, and it's one of many factors that let the Eagle hit its maximum speed of Mach 2.5. But most certainly the biggest factor in that speed are the 2 Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engines pumping out 25,000 pounds of thrust each, which is so much power this thing can take off and immediately go straight to...
Screw gravity.
Because these engines combined produce more thrust than the plane weighs, meaning it can not only go straight up, it can accelerate going straight up. One of my college friends recalled seeing one of these at an air show where the pilot actually brought his plane to a complete stop in a vertical hover just over the runway before flooring the afterburners and Apollo 11ing its way into the rest of the demonstration. And it was performance like this that made the US get some ideas, starting with the Streak Eagle program. Part of the fear of the MiG-25 was all the records it had set during its early days, and now it was the Soviets' turn for a code brown. The The Streak Eagle was a pre-production F-15 stripped of almost everything they could get away with to make it as light as possible, even stripping the paint. Then instead of taking it to a nudist beach, they would proceed to get kinky and chain it to the runway, where the plane would throttle up to max power. At the start of the timer, they'd cut it loose and let that thing bear it all to the entire world as it made a break for the exosphere. They would break the time to altitude record not once, not twice, but 8 times in 17 days, capping out at going from 913 feet, just under 300 meters above sea level, to 30,000 meters, or 98,425 feet above sea level in just under 3.5 minutes. The Streak Eagle could be in orbit by the time you're halfway through plowing the fields. And yes, I do realize that altitude bar was written in the metric system, but that's only because we were explicitly competing with the record set by the MiG-25. It's pure pettiness. We only convert to the other measurement team when we hear some filthy communist saying they don't feel fear.
Let's fix that, shall we?
This not only set the world time to climb record, but also leveled up the mission planning experience, subsequently unlocking the campaign mission where we sent a message to the Soviets saying, "I see no god up here other than me, now get down from that orbit." So it's no real surprise the US Air Force ordered 350 F-15As and another 59 F-15Bs, the 2-seat version. The first F-15 delivered was a B model in 1974 as a trainer, and the first Eagle was assigned to a combat squadron in January 1976. Israel would also order 19 F-15As and 2 F-15Bs, and on June 27, 1979, the Israelis would draw first blood for the Eagle over Lebanon. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad the Eagle got its first kill, but there's a part of me that wishes it was us.
It should have been me!
But it's okay, because if you thought the Eagle A set a tone, it only gets more and more insane from here. The US and other countries would continue to improve the F-15 over time, starting with the C's, the D's, and the E's. The F-15C was an improved Eagle A that came with better avionics, increased the maximum takeoff weight from 40,000 pounds to 68,000 pounds, and gave it an extra 2,000 pounds of internal fuel. But hands down, the most important difference was the added provisions for the Conformal Fuel and Sensor Tactical, or FAST packs. The FAST packs let you store an extra 850 gallons of fuel in aerodynamic tanks on the outside of the plane. You couldn't drop these mid-flight, but to be honest, you wouldn't want to. Punching those before a fight would turn the Eagle into a street magician, because for its next trick, it's gonna make all its weapons disappear. See, the sensor part of that FAST acronym is the wiring required to mount weapons hardpoints on the outside, because the FAST packs mount to the Eagle's pre-existing hardpoints. However, this actually gives the F-15 a major edge in adaptability, because if you want to add new weapons, or just increase the number of weapons, you can upgrade the packs instead of having to spend all the extra money to upgrade the entire airframe. 409 F-15Cs and 61 of their 2-seat variants, the F-15Ds, began entering the US inventory in 1979. 18 F-15Cs and 13 F-15Ds would eventually go to Israel, and 55 Cs and 19 Ds would go to Saudi Arabia. Additionally, Japan would get a license to build slightly reduced versions of the C and D domestically as the Peace Eagles, with the F-15Cs being labeled the F-15J and the F-15Ds being labeled as the F-15DJ, with the first 12 Js being US produced and delivered to the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces starting in 1981. 2 years after that milestone in 1983, the US and later Japan would implement the Multi-Stage Improvement Program, or MSIP, because apparently spiting the laws of physics just isn't good enough. I want these planes to be flying infinity stones. Now, the F-15 had new radars, and the wiring to carry God's chosen missile, the almighty AMRAAM, even though they weren't even in service yet. Then they got GPS, both for targeting the JDAMs and, more importantly, so they know exactly which grid coordinate you owe an apology to when they delete you from it.
What's the blast radius on this bitch?
Yes. That's that.
And the last variant the US had made before getting into another fight was the 2-seat F-15E. The Strike Eagle was introduced in 1988 and came with a reinforced airframe made specifically for converting bad guys into terrain features. And they don't even have to be on the ground. The F-15E can carry so many different weapons it could grind down an enemy's military by itself. If the Wild Weasel Phantom is a Swiss Army knife with a plane attached to it, then this is a defense budget that laughs at God with a plane attached to it. Early versions came with the usual 25,000-pound thrust engines and a slightly decreased thrust-to-weight ratio of 0.97, but later variations would get upgraded turbofans putting out 29,000 pounds, giving the Eagle E a total of 58,000 pounds of thrust. Granted, this came with some drawbacks, like dropping the amount of bullets in the gun from 940 to 500 and slight losses in maneuverability and overall performance, but they also came with a pair of 750-gallon conformal fuel tanks with hardpoints and the ability to carry AMRAAMs. However, the air-to-air punching power pales in comparison to the capacity to ground pound, where according to the Air Force's dedicated webpage, the Strike Eagle can carry, quote, any air-to-surface weapon in the Air Force inventory, nuclear and conventional.
Is that everyone? Like you wanted more?
Do you understand the psychological value of having a plane like this? Not only does the enemy have to figure out which version of the Eagle is in their airspace, even if they figure out it's a Strike Eagle, they have no idea what this thing is going to hit them with unless they can visibly see it. They could get hit with the kitchen sink for all they know. This is the golden ticket of psychological warfare. The US just figured out how to make the physical embodiment of the find out portion of the graph because nobody but America knows what this thing is going to do before it does it, and half the time we operate by the strategy of the enemy can't predict our moves if we don't know what we're doing. You can tell Americans love their casinos because the F-15E is just militarized gambling. Your mode of death will be determined by a roll of the dice. AKA, whatever the hell kind of warhead I feel like putting on your forehead today, which is an advantage that would massively help them in combat. And I don't think anything better embodies the idea of weaponized RNG than the one time a Strike Eagle took out an Mi-24 Hind helicopter with a laser-guided bomb. On February 14, 1991, a pair of F-15Es led by pilot Richard T. Bennett and backseater Daniel B. Bakke were out taking part in the Great Scud Hunt in Desert Storm. Around midway through their patrol, they get an AWACS call that a team of Special Forces operators 300 miles over the border had been found by the Iraqis, and the Iraqis were moving to cut off their escape. Bennett put his wingman in a 4-mile trail behind him to watch his back while he went down through the cloud layer to look for these guys, and he would acquire a visual of 5 helicopters on thermals from 15 to 20 miles away. When he got to 5 to 10 miles, the visual was clear enough to confirm the helicopters as Iraqi Mi-24 Hinds, which had been conducting leapfrogging movements, giving away the drop-off of ground troops. There was also an AA battery firing at them from off to the side, but it's like a flea buzzing in their ears. They straight up ignore all of the AA fire, even as they go right over it. They're screaming in at almost 700 miles an hour, and they decide they're going to swing at the last helicopter when it lands with a GBU-10 laser-guided bomb from 4 miles away, because at that speed, the bomb would fly farther than their Sidewinder missiles. But right as they punched the bomb, the Hind started taking off and getting back in formation, and while Bakke keeps the laser designator on target, Bennett's thinking the bomb isn't going to hit and readies a Sidewinder. And right when the missile gets tone, their 2,000-pounder flies into his thermal sight and direct impacts this Hind. They could see parts of this helicopter go flying in different directions on their thermal scope from a couple miles away, and the explosion, quote, damn near vaporized it.
Literally reduced to atoms. That's not even a Thanos joke.
That is so overkill that I'm pretty sure the command and control had to write that coordinates apology letter. Then they put down a few more bombs to clear out the troops that might have gotten dropped off, while the other helicopters start scattering in panic, which is understandable given that their number 5 just got apparated into a separate dimension. The Spec Ops guys would escape and make it back to confirm the score, and that last bit is important, because this absolute pro gamer move wasn't just style points, it was also the first air-to-air kill by an F-15E Strike Eagle ever. And it was all thanks to a piece of equipment carried by all Strike Eagles during the Great Scud Hunt: the Lantern gear.
Green Lantern can do anything.
Except shut up, apparently.
No, not that kind of lantern gear, this kind of lantern gear. The low-altitude navigation and targeting infrared for night system. This system is made of 2 pods, a navigation pod and a targeting pod. The navigation pod carries a terrain-following radar and a heat sensor that combine to allow the plane to automatically fly at a specific altitude and auto-dodge obstacles like hills and trees, basically turning your plane into a hovercraft. The targeting pod is where the pyromaniacal magic happens. This thing is a forward-looking infrared sensor or a heat sensor that can only look forward, a laser designator, an automatic tracking program, and a missile bore sight correlator for heat-seeking versions of the Maverick missiles, which I can only describe as a Control-Alt hotkey, because if you want something gone, all you gotta do is fly towards a target and press delete to make the enemy's system shut down. This means that Strike Eagles can both autopilot you over the ground and give their weapons an auto-hit buff, and if you're not picking up what I'm putting down, that means Lockheed just turned Blue Bally into a fucking battle strategy. These things might look like a pair of giant shafts you bolt onto the hard points somewhere, but they should have called them Un-Viagra, because it's gonna seek out the weapon site somebody just erected, refuse to date the planet at every conceivable opportunity, and then make that weapon site dysfunctional. Equipping your F-15E with a set of lantern pods might as well be hacking, because you're both botting your movement and hit-scanning the enemy team into a dartboard. It's the story of warfare. If you're not cheating, you're not trying, and with the ability to cheat death and the enemy out of nice things, it's really no surprise that the F-15 has the ultimate in gamer stats with a KD ratio of 104-0. Stupid American, an F-15 was shut down during your Desert Storm operation. No it wasn't, and I looked into that. During the Iraqi Operation Samora and Desert Storm, the Iraqis planned to challenge the F-15s that have been turning them into danger playgrounds all over the sandbox. On January 30th, 1991, the Iraqis would see a window of attack when two F-15Cs in a 4-ship flight within scramble range of two of their airfields split up and went back for refueling. I would say they're already off to a cheap start, attacking after half your enemy leaves, but that would actually make it a fair fight. The Iraqis would only be able to scramble two MiG-25s to attack them, one from each of those airfields I mentioned. AWACS call out the bogeys to the Americans, and the remaining Eagles on patrol turn into the fight and fire the first shot. However, even into Desert Storm, the Sparrow missile would continue to be a demonstration of why they're called missiles and not hittles, and the first AIM-7 would miss and the second wouldn't even fire. The second Eagle would also try to fire on the MiGs, but 3 of his Sparrows wouldn't shoot at all. So at minimum, 5 out of 8 Sparrows just said good luck with the war and quit, while at the same time, one Iraqi MiG-25 fires an R-40 missile back at the Eagles, and it detonates behind one of them.
Ooh, that is the closest thing you've done to damage since I've gotten here.
Damages the left engine, doesn't even come close to knocking it out. Both Eagles would continue fighting until their other half returned, at which point the MiG-25s would run home. The F-15s would leave the area, and a smuggler would supposedly find Eagle wreckage in the desert a few days later, and this is where people like to say, oh, that counts as a kill. First of all, that trusts the word of a smuggler, and second, what most likely happened was the F-15 took the hit, lost an engine, probably lost a stabilator, maybe even a rudder, both of which it has 2 of, then kept fighting until the rest of its pack joined it and chased off the enemy. The F-15 didn't go down before the enemy left, and the pilot flew it out of the area. That isn't a kill, that's a nuisance, because if you think that a damaged Eagle that continued fighting couldn't bring its pilot home, then boy do I have news for you, because the Eagle has shrugged off way worse. On May 1st, 1983, 2 of Israel's new F-15Ds were set up in a training exercise as defenders against 4 A-4N Skyhawk aggressor airframes. During this training exercise, one of the A-4 Skyhawk airframes collided with the right wing of one of the F-15s and disintegrated right after the pilot ejected. The F-15, flown by Ziv Navidi, entered a spin, and as the plane fell, for some reason he decided to punch the plane into full afterburner. His intention was probably to try and use the sheer thrust-to-weight ratio of the F-15 to overpower the spin and stabilize the plane, literally beat the laws of physics into submission. And because it's the F-15, it worked. Navidi tried slowing down, but the plane began to roll again, so he punched the afterburners back on and headed for home. All the while, neither him or his instructor backseater being able to see through the stream of white fuel vapor coming out of the right side. And since he couldn't slow down, Navidi opted to try and land at twice the normal speed, dropping his gear and emergency tailhook at nearly 300 miles an hour. Naturally, the tailhook, not being designed for speeds anywhere near that, was ripped off the aircraft like a collector opening his last card pack, and they had to slam the brakes to stop, only stopping 20 feet shy of the barrier that would have converted them to an accordion. It was at this point that Navidi looked back to shake hands with his instructor and realized exactly how much of a miracle it was they'd even gotten back. The entire right wing was sheared off about 2 feet out from the base of the airplane. They had flown for 10 miles with one wing. And of course, McDonnell Douglas wanted to figure out if they were BSing or not when they heard about it, because if they weren't, just think of the marketing value. Imagine you're sitting there competing for a foreign contract bid and your team just looks over at one of the other teams like, what does your plane do? And they're like, oh, you know, takes out more planes, drops more bombs, and has better radar. What about yours? And you say, we can fly with one wing. The other team would just get up and leave. Like, how do you even compete with something that disobeys the laws of science? Even the other Israeli pilots were ready to jump ship, because one of Navidi's friends, an F-16 pilot, saw the damage he had survived, and the first thing out of his mouth was, can I transfer to the F-15s? Old McDonald's aircraft farm would come by and investigate the plane, and they realized the body of the F-15 was so wide that at a high enough speed it could act as a flight stabilizer itself. The F-15 is literally the epitome of even a brick can fly if you throw it hard enough. So what happens when you throw it into the future? Some countries would get their own versions of the F-15E Strike Eagle, namely Israel flying roughly 25 F-15I Ba'azes, South Korea flying a total of 61 F-15K Slam Eagles, and Saudi Arabia flying 72 of the slightly downgraded F-15S. However, even without US funding, development of the Eagle would continue. Later on down the line, Saudi Arabia would request a massively upgraded F-15E variant dubbed the F-15SA, and in 2011 they both ordered 84 of them and requested upgrades for 70 of their existing F-15S fleet to the same standard. Qatar would also later order 36 similarly improved F-15s called the F-15QAs. And thanks to these countries funding the research and development directly, when the US started looking for cheaper force multiplier options to assist its growing fleet of F-35s in ways that the older F-15s and 16s just couldn't do, Boeing had an answer. So if a fighter jet that spites the laws of physics and carries every weapon the biggest defense budget on the planet can buy isn't enough, then I present to you the F-15EX Eagle II. Israel already wants to buy 25 of them starting in 2031, dubbed the F-15IA, with options for 25 more, and the US plans to buy 104 of them for now. And Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and even Singapore are looking at buying in on it. Because this is the ultimate Eagle. For now anyway, because at this rate the Eagle's gonna be about as forever as the Buff. The F-15EX has the two 29,000-pound thrust engines that can keep the Eagle II's top speed at about Mach 2.5. Modern avionics and cockpit layouts, the same broadband data link as the F-35 and F-22 to receive and act on targeting data, and then they turned it into a bastard sword. This plane can have 1 or 2 seats. The same plane. You can collect or separate the controls of the aircraft into either the 1-seat or 2-seat layout, depending on whether or not it's required, and change the allocation of seats and controls on the ground. Need to grind some flight hours with the National Guard on limited manpower? Set it up for 1 seat. Need to go on a training flight? Add a 2nd seat. Need to pound the planet hard enough to make people talk? Strap some weapons controls into that 2nd seat and bolt on some lantern gear. Need to fly into the battlefield of the future with Skynet as a wingman? Turn that backseater into a drone operator and get their rear in gear.
Avengers, time to work for a living.
Modular glory hole, cockpits are not a feature I ever thought I'd be this excited about, but here we are. This degree of logistical flexibility is a complete mission changer. Now you can't even tell by the radar indicator what the Eagle doing when it shows up on your radar scope. If that thing shows up, it's gonna be code brown toilet deluxe everywhere. And that flexibility pales in comparison to what you can do in this thing now that it's got a fly-by-wire control system. Instead of pulling back hard on the stick for a turn and hoping your plane doesn't just fall out of the sky from losing too much speed, you can just slam the stick back, let the computer stop it, and use your maximum effective turn radius every time. And because this is easily one of the most modern fly-by-wire control systems out there, the engineers were able to remove the angle of attack limiter. Not increase, remove. For those of us who don't speak fighter jet, this is a system that prevents you from making your plane move so hard that you lose damn near all your speed and fall. You do not pass go, you do not collect $200, you just get padlocked into a blind date with a grid coordinate and die. It's like having a safety for your concealed carry flight performance, and the F-15 is so broadly high-performing it doesn't have one. Test pilots have been quoted as saying the F-15 can now pull off maneuvers that until now have been restricted to thrust vectoring aircraft, meaning that all of those pretty moves you see the Russians using in air shows with their super maneuverable fighter jets pretty much just amount to fancy ways of dancing themselves into their coffins. And because the flight computer and the fly-by-wire controls automatically handles rebalancing of the aircraft, this means you can also store way more weapons on the Eagle because the pilot doesn't have to fight the weight imbalance when they drop one. This enabled far outboard weapon stations and a total of, and let me check my notes here, 23 weapons hardpoints. There isn't a fighter jet on the planet with that many options for scheduling people an appointment with their god of choice. Hell, I'm not even sure there's a car salesman out there asking about your car's extended warranty that has that many options in front of them. The A-10's only got half that many hard points, and the F-35 can't even make that much in a beast mode run. The F-15EX turns a regular combat engagement into an ace combat speed run because it's perfectly built for the task of being a missile truck, aka carrying an assload of missiles to fire on targets marked by forward stealth fighters. And guess what? Those targets can include stealth fighters, not just because the F-35s and F-22s can target them, but the F-15EX can also target them.
Boo.
Yeah, not only does it spite the laws of physics, not only does it carry every weapon known to God, it also turns stealth into a corporate buzzword. In the fiscal year 2024 report for the Office of the Director, Operational Test and Evaluation, the DOT&E stated, quote, "Against the level of threat tested, the F-15EX is operationally effective in all its air superiority roles, including defensive and offensive counter-air against surrogate 5th-generation adversary aircraft, as well as basic air-to-ground capability against the tested threats. The F-15EX was able to detect and track all threats at advantageous ranges, use onboard and offboard systems to identify them, and deliver weapons while surviving." Now, just for clarity, the word surrogate means substitute. And since the United States always trains harder than the real thing, that means that surrogate 5th-generation adversary aircraft they used in testing was either an F-35 or an F-22. And since F-35s have been part of Operation Red Flag for the last 4 years as dedicated aggressor aircraft, that's probably what they tested it against. Which means the F-15EX can detect, track, and fire on the second most stealthy fighter jet on the planet. Or third, now that the US has finally unveiled the F-47 NGAD 6th-generation fighter at advantageous ranges and not die. I don't even know how this is possible. The internet's been having circle jerk conversations for years over whether the F-22, F-35, Su-57, or J-20 is the better stealth check modifier. And meanwhile, the F-15EX is over here casting sea invisibility at will without spell slots. If you told me that Boeing stole the secret formula to Lockheed Martin's pixie dust that they strapped onto the F-22 and rubbed it into this plane, I'd believe you.
Yes!
The only real downside of the F-15EX is the price tag, but it's not even that bad, and it's purely an issue of scale. As I mentioned in a previous video, the F-15EX currently prices out around $90 million a bird, with the F-35A sitting around $82.5 million apiece. But the F-35 gets twice as many built per year than the F-15EX, so you can bet your rear that they could put this thing on the DoD clearance rack if they were able to make more of them. And when they do buy more of them, they're not spending as much on maintenance because the major rework to the F-15EX's wiring and the new open systems architecture, or the ability to only have to change parts of its code to handle new weapon systems, means reduced maintenance costs across the board. The only thing this plane doesn't have is stealth, and while that means it sure won't be the tip of the spear in a fight, you can bet your life savings it'll be doing literally everything else. If the original Eagle is one of the greatest fighter jets of all time, we're gonna need to come up with some new words to describe what this thing's gonna do to the enemy, or at the very least to the Geneva Convention. And that right there is the entire story of how multiple doctrine officials with their heads up their own asses managed to magically create the one fighter jet that is not only still alive and kicking just as hard as it used to, but is already prepared to start turning its enemies' most advanced capabilities into punchlines. So in summation, whether you're the enemy, the politicians, or straight up morons, don't take America out to the circus or we will summon up the spirit of our country and build the one fighter jet that can dig you a grave at Mach fuck in so many ways even time hasn't figured them all out yet. And before we go for the day, I have something cool for all of you. We have merch! We have a tumbler, a coffee mug, stickers, a t-shirt, which is actually really nice, and in commemoration of our running Twitch channel meme, a Lockmart poster, all complete with various renditions of my fictitious face and a spoiler for my upcoming logo. You can find all of these and more at the now revamped Guild website, linked in the description below as always. Thank you for watching. If you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.